Good morning, everybody. My name is Laura Hadland. I'm the Senior Curator for Leicester Arts and Museum Service. And I've got 15 minutes to tell you a little bit about the development of an exhibition in just 8 short weeks. I work with the archaeology and Egyptology collections for Leicester Arts and Museums. So obviously this last year has been a very exciting time for us on the archaeology of Leicester. And it was roughly almost to the day a year ago where the City Mayor gave me a small budget and asked me to create an exhibition which would tell the people of Leicester everything they wanted to know about the discovery of King Richard III. The only problem was at this time we had no idea whether or not King Richard III had actually been found. And so in the beginning, a few years ago, probably about 3 years ago now, a number of meetings started to take place between the City Council, the University of Leicester Archaeological Service, and Philippa Langley, who is a member of the Richard III Society. Philippa was keen for us to look for Richard III's mortal remains, and so we started to look back at the evidence. Everybody knew roughly where King Richard III had been buried in Leicester. You can see from the quotes on the screen here that historians have been covering the subject matter for well over a century. And so we knew at least the rough area of the city to search in. King Richard III had been buried in the Church of the Greyfriars. And conveniently enough, there is a street in Leicester called Greyfriars, and it happened to be just around the corner from there. So it wasn't too difficult. And so people say, well, why didn't it happen before? And the problem was that this is a research archaeological project, not a rescue archaeological project. And since the beginning of the planning guidance, PPG 16, most archaeology in the city has been based on a rescue kind of format where planners and developers pay for the archaeology. There just isn't the money anymore, the same as the heyday of the 70s and 80s, where archaeology can be done on a research basis just because there's a very valid research question to answer. We're protecting the archaeology, not necessarily answering every question that we would like to. And so a desk-based assessment was undertaken because Philippa was able to raise the money to support that sort of assessment of the situation. You can see again from the quotes that there was absolutely a good case for the finding of Richard III, but at the same time there were lots of counter arguments as to why he might not be there anymore. There was the pervasive but unfounded historical rumour that at the time of the Reformation his remains had been excavated and thrown by jeering crowds into the River Soar. There is, of course, the potential for later archaeological levels to sink through where the burial was made and destroy the evidence. This can also happen through things, non-human interventions such as burrowing animals, those sorts of things. And also, he might not have been exactly within the area of the car park that we could dig. There could still have been modern buildings on top of any burial remains that were still there, and so there was no way that the University of Leicester could have found him. And so it was kind of a 1 in a million, I think it's probably safe to say. It's something that Richard Buckley, the head of the archaeological unit and the director of the excavation, freely admitted at the beginning. It was extremely unlikely that we would find him. However, as the curator of the museum service, I was delighted that this research dig was going to take place because it meant that we were ultimately going to find out more about the medieval friary of the Greyfriars. So it was win-win for me, whatever happened. Happy days. And so the excavation began in August 2012. You can see from this map that 3 trenches were sunk. They're extremely long trenches, several metres long each. And the reason for this was because we didn't know exactly where we were looking. These long trenches are intended to sample the area in order to find walls, pick up walls where you could start to identify buildings and features and then organise what the alignment of the church might have been. You can see that walls were indeed picked up. In Trench 2, very early on, we started to see a cloister walk, but you can see that the ULAS managed to hit the cloister walk directly along its axis, and so we had no idea which side the cloister garth was for a while. This is why Trench 3 went in. There's kind of a whole convoluted argument as to why all these trenches went where they did, which in 15 minutes I probably shouldn't cover. But the key thing, of course, for the development of my exhibition and the unfolding of this story is that very first kind of layers of Trench 1 being taken up, some human remains were found. But because there was no idea which alignment the church was on at that time, there was no clear evidence whether or not this was a burial in the choir of the Church of Greyfriars, which was the key location. And so they were covered for the time, and left for until 2 weeks later, when it became clear that they were very interesting remains indeed. You can see here a quote from Matthew Morris, who actually excavated the skeleton those 2 weeks later, and he realised as the excavation took place that not only was this an adult male skeleton in the correct location within the Church of the Greyfriars, but also it had very interesting pathologies to the spine, a clear scoliosis sufferer, and also some very severe battle wounds, and this trauma was analysed later on. Now, at this time, there was a press conference by the University of Leicester to say that an interesting skeleton had been found, but that the university were not 100% as to whether this was the remains of King Richard III. And so they were undertaking further analysis, and a report would be released in due time. This was when we started to think that the public would need to have their questions answered about what was taking place in the city. Already at this stage, we knew that this was an exciting discovery, regardless of whether the remains were proved to be Richard III or not. And this is when I started working with colleagues at the university to track their analysis of the excavation and of the human remains. So you can see here, this is the skeleton with the bottom half of Dr. Joe Appleby from the University of Leicester analysing the remains. And as time went on and preparations for the exhibition started, this is when I really realised it was going to be a truly unique museological experience, because I was writing an exhibition not just where the conclusion was uncertain, but where the interpretation was changing daily. So we had experts like Joe, also experts from the Royal Armouries in Leeds and various universities around the country, all being brought together by the University of Leicester to analyse these remains and to start to think what the best explanation was for the battle trauma, for the analysis of the different pathologies to the spine, looking at absolutely every element, the radiocarbon dating, and of course the DNA analysis. And day by day, these draft reports were changing, and somehow I had to try and incorporate that into easy to understand panels, which would create a whole exhibition to tell this story for the public. It was trickier than I expected, but perhaps that's obvious in retrospect. And so finally we came round to the press conference on the 4th of February earlier this year. We all know that the announcement was made that the identity of the skeleton as King Richard III had been confirmed beyond all reasonable doubt. And I think as the evidence unfolded through that time, it's very clear that actually beyond reasonable doubt is entirely the case. I personally cannot see any other explanation for the evidence that is there. And 2 days later, the exhibition opened. Happily, we were able to invite all of the media down from that press conference to come and see the Guildhall exhibition, but it was a real race to the finish. As I was saying, the interpretation kept changing, and as was mentioned in the press conference, the last bit of DNA analysis literally did come in probably about 48 hours before that press conference took place. And so my lovingly handcrafted panel about interpreting the DNA evidence was unceremoniously dumped, and a new one was written in a very short space of time and put up ready for the public opening. So it really was down to the wire. And this is it. It was a very complicated exhibition from a museum curator's perspective to develop. It was a very small gallery because essentially it was the only space we had. Of course, our exhibitions programme is put into place years in advance, and so fitting a new exhibition in with just 2 months to go is a complex operation. So those of you who come to visit will see it's a small space, but it's an extremely complex story. We wanted to make sure, as per the City Mayor's brief, that we were explaining everything that the public might want answered about this excavation. So it is a complicated narrative. It isn't immediately family friendly, and so we wanted to also find a way to make it accessible for both young and old. And finally, there were embargoed images and information. All of the draft reports that I was privy to, all of the photographs of the remains were all under strict embargo until after the University of Leicester's press conference, for obvious reasons. And so that did mean when we were installing the exhibition, the printers, the designers all had to be signed into the university's confidentiality agreements. And also when we were installing the exhibition, the staff from the Guildhall weren't actually allowed to see the panels. We had to screw things to the wall and then immediately cover them over with blankets and sheets so that we weren't breaking the confidentiality agreement, which is literally something I imagine I will never have to do in my career ever again. So the exhibition itself has two distinct layers of graphic style. This is where we try to look at the contrast between giving the visitor the historical contextual information about Richard III, who he was, why he ended up in Leicester, and why, perhaps more significantly, he ended up dying and being buried in Leicester, on this kind of brown, almost manuscript kind of feel. And the other side being the more scientific analysis, looking at the excavation, how and why that evidence was recovered and how it was pieced together to confirm the identity of the remains in this more, shall we call it, perhaps a CSI sort of pseudo-scientific style. The objects within the exhibition have kind of two different functions. On the left of the screen, you can see the case of objects which were actually from that 2012 Summer Greyfriars excavation. So these are the real objects from the church where King Richard III was buried. And on the right, you can see we have more contextual objects which were taken from the existing medieval collections of Leicester Arts and Museum Service to give people more information about the nature of medieval friaries and a bit more of a feel for what the city of Leicester was like at the time of Richard III. We've teamed up with our partners both at De Montfort University and at the University of Loughborough in order to bring new technologies into the exhibition. You can see on the left here we have the 3D printout of the skull of Richard III. This has been refined over time and we now have a significantly higher resolution model on display in the gallery. This of course is to help visitors to imagine not only what the weapons trauma looks like on the real skull, but also put in context of examining of that battle trauma to help them understand exactly what those final moments may have been like for Richard III. Because of course we have not and will never have the skeleton of Richard III on display, certainly within the museum service. And so we found that this has been a really useful interpretive tool for the public to actually get that 3D visualization of the skull. The CAT data that was used to produce that printout was also used to develop this facial reconstruction on the right-hand side at the University of Dundee. And this again is built up using average metric data in order to create a kind of more lifelike presentation of what the king may have looked like in life. This technique has obviously been developed and refined in the University of Dundee. Some of you may have seen the amazing work they did with the remains of Philip of Macedon, the father of Alexander the Great, who suffered horrific battle trauma. But interestingly enough, they focus, of course, on a living image of Richard III, which has been on tour all around the country now and will be going to the British Museum very shortly. So if you haven't seen it, do pop down there. And that has been, again, another way in for the public to understand what this skeleton represents, a real person with a real story. The exhibition is split down into 4 narrators to simplify the narrative and also to kind of show the real multidisciplinary effort that went into the identification of the remains. We have the bioarchaeologist, the historian, the archaeologist and finally the scientist, all of whose disciplines came together to create this final narrative and this conclusive identification. The interactives within the exhibition also break the story down further, the large skeleton touch table that you see in this image being particularly key as it really breaks down all those final questions that I found the public were bringing back to me again and again. I was fortunate, or not, depending on which way you look at it, to spend about 3 weeks during the time of the excavation, standing by the burial area and answering the public's questions as they filed past during the open days. And I realised that people were really interested in the elements like why the burial was found with their hands together, why there was no feet on the skeleton, all those kind of contextual questions which don't have immediately obvious answers. And so that touchscreen attempts to answer all of those. Forgive me for not speaking in more detail, obviously with such a short time frame. Can't really get into all these questions, but hopefully we can answer some of your questions later. So finally, the impact of the exhibition has been absolutely mind-blowing. We've had over 150,000 visitors there now since February this year when we opened. And that is to a building, Leicester Guildhall, which usually gets somewhere on average of 35,000 visitors a year. It's been absolutely incredible. You see that they've been queuing around the block, and we've been collecting data from visitors in the form of comments in the visitors book and also kind of written evaluation. And we've really found that they've enjoyed the exhibition and come back, which I've personally found quite surprising because it is such a small exhibition, it's such a small space. I haven't been able to really change very much in the space apart from when we brought the facial reconstruction in and then sent it on its way around the country. And so there hasn't been anything particularly new for people to see, and yet they still come back and word of mouth is spread. And it's really felt like this has been not just something which has been attracting tourists from international locations from across the country, but also something that has really captured the hearts of the people of Leicester. Some of my favourite comments about the exhibition have been from local people, from local estates, who really talk about how they didn't have an interest in archaeology or history before all of this happened. And then visiting the exhibition, understanding more about the excavation, has meant that now they have a real thirst for knowledge about their local history, which for me as a museum curator is essentially the most satisfying thing I can hear from any visitor. And so I really hope that some of you are interested in visiting the exhibition later. We can perhaps talk in a bit more detail in some of the problems and also the achievements in creating an exhibition in 8 weeks. And I hope you enjoyed finding out a little bit more about another person's perspective on King Richard III. Thank you.